Hello, dear participants, and welcome to the second of the DRBF Insight webinar series for Region 2, Renewables and Dispute Boards. My name is Georgiana Takuch, and I'm a member of the DRBF Board of Directors Region 2, representing Europe, and I'm your host for today. For those of you who are new to DRBF, the Dispute Resolution Board Foundation was established in 1996 as a non-profit organization by a group of professionals involved in construction dispute resolution. Their goal was to promote the use of the DB process and to serve as an educational resource and information exchange for owners, contractors, and DB members. It may be of interest for you to note that the DRBF is publishing a dispute board manual, a guide to best practices and procedure, which was last updated in 2019. In the current conditions of the pandemics, we would like to tell you also that last year, DRBF has also published a best practice guidelines for virtual DB proceedings that comes together with a checklist for the DB members in preparation of those virtual meetings. Today, we will attempt to demonstrate why dispute boards and renewable energy projects offer synergistic growth. And our moderator is Nicholas Rigby. Nick is a chartered engineer and a fellow of the Energy Institute and has more than 35 years experience across the industry. He started NRG Management Consultancy to provide contract management and expert witness services to energy companies who find themselves involved in disputes. His primary focus is on grid and offshore wind projects. Prior to starting NRG Management Consultancy, Nick was head of contract management at Low Carbon Contracts and dispute director and head of strategy at RWE Energy. He will be joined today by John Halcrow. John is the managing director of Shetland Marine Echo, a marine survey and consultancy company providing a range of services, including a marine warranty survey, client marine representation, and expert witness. In recent years, John has become increasingly involved in dispute resolution. He is a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Shipbrokers, a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, and a supporting member of the London Maritime Arbitrators Association, as well as a member of the International Institute of Marine Surveyors, and has trained as an accredited mediator with the Center for Effective Dispute Resolution. Keith Daly is the managing director of Quantum Energy, with a main focus on the energy sector, especially the offshore winds and renewable market. He is highly experienced in FIDIC contracts and has skillfully dealt with numerous international construction disputes and has been appointed as an expert witness to mechanical, electrical, and plumbing projects. Last but not least, Sean Gibbs. Sean is the CEO of the global expert provider Hanscom International, with over 30 years experience across the global onshore and offshore construction and engineering industries. Sean has acted as quantum expert before various dispute resolution tribunals. Sean is also sitting as an arbitrator, adjudicator, expert, determiner, and dispute board member. And starting from this month, he joined the DRBF Board of Directors of Region 2. So welcome, Sean. And with all this being said, I would like to pass the floor to Nicholas Rigby, who will be our moderator for today. As I've said before, please make sure to put your questions in the chat box. We will address them either as we go or at the end. Please feel free to interact and put as many questions as you wish. Nicholas, if you please.
Georgiana, thank you very much. So I'm going to put renewables into context in terms of looking at it from the market size, and from some work done by Irina, that they believe that between 2016 and 2050, over $100 trillion will be spent in the renewables and some of the related sectors. But just to put this into context, the annual figure associated with this spend would be 25% of the current total global spend on construction, which is $12 trillion per annum. So sorry, it'd be 25% of that 12. So that's $3 trillion. A number of new or industries that have only recently got established, including renewables, energy efficiency, carbon capture and storage, and electrification. So as I suspect we're all very aware, some very significant changes. What this graphic does is it actually emphasizes how material those changes are going to be. If we look at the growth, which is in blue of wind, we can see not only is this an industry we think of today as being, let's say, established, the growth by 2050 is absolutely enormous in this sector. Similarly, solar PV will also be subject to material growth. And we can see some of the other sectors there as well. Worth pointing out that of wind, 30% of that will be offshore, and we'll be talking about that next. I want to focus on 3 areas in terms of where dispute boards can make a significant difference. Offshore wind, as I just mentioned, complex projects given them operating in the marine environment, medium term in terms of period of construction, and made more complex by the contract structure. So there's multiple contracts in terms of typically 5 major contractors undertaking the work. Energy from waste, again, complex technology, the term usually medium, but they do have the benefit of usually being able to provide a single contractor who will give you an EPC wrap. And then finally, hydro, again, complex, particularly associated with ground conditions. The construction and life of the project are both long-term, making it more challenging from a contractual point of view. Again, some good news there is that you can get an EPC wrap. So on one of those topics, I'd now like to hand over to Sean. He's going to talk about energy, to John Halcrow, who's going to talk about offshore wind.
Thank you, Nick, and good morning to everyone attending. Yes, I'm going to give an overview of offshore wind farm developments. Offshore wind will be a major contributor as we transition away from hydrocarbons as our primary energy source. So I'm going to focus on 4 key areas that relative to the industry. I started with the first of these, what comprises an offshore wind farm. Well, your wind turbines themselves, clearly, balance of plant, and that's a term that we use for just about everything else offshore, which would be the fabricating and installation of the foundations, the installation of the wind turbines onto those foundations, construction of an offshore substation, and then your cable supply and installation, which would include your interfield array cabling and the export cabling to shore. And then there'll be onshore works, construction of an onshore substation, and then other connections onward to the grid. So starting with the turbines, to give us an impression of what these developments are all about, and how these machines have evolved over the last 30 years. We see that machines going in at the moment, generally around 10 megawatt, 200 meter rotor diameter, but we have designs 15 megawatt, 250 meter rotor diameter coming down the track. And to put that in some perspective, if you consider the length of a rotor blade, one rotor blade, it's way in excess of that of a football pitch. These are truly enormous machines and require a substantial foundation to support them. These are fabricated onshore and then transported offshore, usually by barge, for rendezvous at the offshore location with heavy lift vessel. Jack-up type heavy lift vessels predominate in the industry, and as that photograph shows, we see one in the process of positioning a foundation unit for location on the seabed. Then it's installation of the turbine. Again, jack-up type vessels will perform this function. The turbine tower sections now usually just transported and positioned in one piece, then the nacelle and the rotor blades are bolted on after that. The offshore substations, Again, follow a similar process, prefabricated foundation positioned on the seabed initially, and then a fully assembled topside unit transported to the location, and then another heavy lift operation to put that, to fit that on in one lift. So if we now look at bringing the energy ashore, then transmission networks. These vary across different jurisdictions. If we take, for example, the UK, the regulator Ofgem requires separation between the generator, that's the wind farm developer, and the transmission system operator. Current arrangements are likely to change. Yes, these are contractually complex areas and will need to evolve as the industry evolves. But I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So here we have an illustration of the route to shore, the wind farm, offshore wind farm, your offshore substation, export cable to shore, onshore substation, and then onward connection to the grid. Looking at future technical developments, net zero targets and electrification of oil and gas installations. There's been a lot of discussion over the years in regard to electrifying offshore oil and gas production, but there's real momentum now, driven by a general acceptance that the only realistic route to the industry meeting its net zero commitments is by electrification. Again, if we use the UK as an example, that's been reflected in the recent North Sea transition deal negotiated between the UK government and the industry, which includes sector investment of £3 billion specifically targeted at electrification of these installations. Transmission networks, as I said, these will need to evolve with the industry. Again, using the UK as an example, the current arrangements are recognised as not compatible going forward. That's with the number of large-scale developments that are coming on stream. And that's due to physical limitations, such as the availability of suitable landfall points along the coastline, and a broad acceptance of the need for more integration of networks to coordinate for efficiency. Mitigating the intermittency of wind power, well, critics of wind power will always cite this. They'll say when there's no power, no wind, sorry, there's no power, and there's lots of wind, there's a surplus of power. And that leads us to storage solutions such as batteries, hydrogen electrolysis, or green hydrogen as it's termed. These are complex new technologies and will likely form integral elements of overall wind farm developments in the future, thus really adding to the scale and complexity of these projects. So that brings us to potential dispute flashpoints. Where do we start really? New technologies and standards, sequencing of all these major operations, integration of onshore and offshore elements, and the transmission system operation, wherever that develops going forward. All of these are potential areas for dispute. And that's why, consequent to that, I'm absolutely convinced that dispute boards can play an important role in assisting this industry as it develops. So I hope I've given an overview that's of some benefit in describing an industry that's now rolling forward at a considerable pace. And I welcome any thoughts or questions that this presentation might inspire. So I'll now hand over to Keith, who's going to look more into contractual issues and developer tenderer engagement. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Interesting overview of offshore wind. And good morning, everybody. What I'd like to focus on today really is looking at dispute boards and within the energy sector in its identity itself. I mean, it's clear that renewable energy is becoming more of a focus for the industry. What do we need to look at? We need to look at, in my view, early engagement with contractors and employers. We need to look at early involvement in the tender process. And we need to look at tender periods to ensure that the contractual mechanisms can ensure that we get buildability and bankability for these types of projects. And we need to look at a collaborative approach with the employer, the contractors and fabricators. The development of renewables within the energy industry is really a key focus for most of the countries that have the largest economical growth. But that protectionism is a difficult area that we need to deal with. Historically, they've been looking at arbitration as the preferred route for resolution as a mechanism for solving energy disputes within projects. But we should look at how we can develop dispute boards to resolve these issues in a mechanism that is much more of an easier process, as opposed to considerable litigation measures. And how we can move this forward is a key point of the renewable development process at this point in time. If we look at the global enforceability of adjudication, it is common for renewables projects to involve international parties, and their assets could be spread across numerous jurisdictions. That makes it difficult to resolve disputes with international adjudications. If you look at the New York Convention and how many parties are involved in the convention, there are 60 states involved in arbitration, where arbitration enforcement is very difficult. What we need to do is to look at how we can make the decision makers accept dispute boards as the right way of resolving these disputes, making things more practical and also more amiable for the decision makers to understand the process. And that will remove the lengthy court proceedings. I mean, if we look at arbitration hearings at the moment in the UK, we're looking at probably about 1.9 months before you can get a hearing. One of the areas that we need to look at is within disputes, and I've identified a short picture there which just shows the complexity of offshore wind and renewable energy, and the whole process involved in the potential dispute boards that could result from offshore wind. What we need to do is to ensure that the flexibility of the process is demonstrated as a benefit to employers, and they realize this as the way forward. It's important that neutrality of projects and the parties that are involved allow that the jurisdictions don't become an issue to developing the project, and therefore the dispute board would benefit that sort of process. My view on the renewable energy sector is to ensure that we get early engagement of employer, contractor and fabricator in the projects of offshore wind, renewable energy, solar, tidal. And to do that, we need to demonstrate to the employers and to the contractors and fabricators that the preferred route for contractual mechanisms has to be dispute boards and not arbitration, which is currently the view that most of the projects are taking internationally. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Keith. Hello, everybody. I'm Sean Gibbs. I'm sure most of you know me that are members of the DRBF, and I'd like to thank anyone that voted for me in the recent elections. My talk today is going to be on about the waste to energy sector and the need for dispute boards. The market size of waste to energy is significant. It's currently $32.3 billion in 2020, and it's going to grow to $48.5 billion. Waste processing itself is quite a straightforward process. Typically, a municipality will bring waste to a site. It is then burnt, and this will produce power, fuel, or heat. The real growth area, though, is going to be in foreign jurisdictions that currently landfill. Africa and Asia particularly haven't really developed their waste to energy sectors, and they predominantly landfill. If you look at the graph, it's a significant amount of waste going in those areas to landfill, and they need to avoid this. The history of waste to energy is that it's been around for over 100 years. You think with a technology that's been around for so long, there wouldn't be problems, but this isn't the case in theory. Quite often people will try new technologies on their plant and this leads to problems. The UK experience of waste to energy has been particularly bad. I believe that this will be replicated in waste to energy projects around the globe. Projects have been marked by disputes and insolvencies. And despite using various forms of contract, such as NEC, FIDIC and ICHEMI in the UK, there's been problems. Repeated litigation has meant that companies have pulled out of this particular sector. M&W high-tech projects, which we'll see on 3 cases, have fallen out with designers. Also with NG Fabricom, who was a subcontractor on a particular project under a FIDIC, under an ICHEMI yellow book. And similarly, they've fallen out with C. Spencer as well in another project where it was an ICHEMI form of subcontract used in that particular case. Litigation doesn't just apply to contractors. You'll see it also with the local authorities, the municipalities that hire people. The case of Essex County Council at EBB Waste in 2020 saw significant damages running into hundreds of millions of pounds being sought. Disputes and insolvencies mean that funders have to question whether they can operate in the sector. One big funder, Aviva, questioned its investments in energy to waste after 3 power plants it invested in were mired in legal disputes. Overseas countries are going to be the growth area for some of the largest waste to energy projects. Dubai is just building a $900 million waste to energy project. It involves international contractors and also international funders. Similarly, Abu Dhabi is currently going out for requests for quotations for a plan to waste to energy. Just like Dubai, is going to be high value international contractors and international funders. Dispute boards aren't usually used in the Middle East. They're struck out from the FIDIC provisions, and it would make sense if they were included for these type of projects. Mexico has just built a recent, Mexico City just built a large waste to energy plant, and it's not only the construction, but also the operation phase. It's going to operate for about 30 years. This too is mired with problems when disgruntled locals took out an injunction. If a dispute board had been up and running, there was no doubt that people could have made interim requests for compensation from the injunction and its impacts during the course. Now, most standard forms of contract that we see used for projects include for dispute boards, so it seems ridiculous to exclude these provisions in the contracts. The 99 forms of FIDIC contract had a dispute adjudication board. The 2017 forms of FIDIC contract have a dispute avoidance and adjudication board, and it's my opinion that this is a preferable form of contract to be used, as it's better to avoid disputes rather than need a binding decision. Similarly, NEC 4 has now got a dispute avoidance board provision, though there's very few countries that use this internationally. Hong Kong, South Africa, Ireland's done a few projects, and also Australia are now using NEC 4. Finally, the ICHEMI forms of contract do provide for a dispute review board, but it's not a dispute adjudication board. And it's my submission that a dispute avoidance and adjudication board is more preferable than a review board. That's the end of my presentation, and now we're going to field questions. Thank you.
Hi, everybody.
Nick, there's a few questions come in. Do you want me to?
Yeah, just before you do that, John, just to explain, please put your questions in the chat box. If you would rather not ask the question yourself, then put moderator before you put the question in. But otherwise, we'll ask you to propose your question. So, John, please.
Well, Gerhard has a question. Gerhard, do you want to post it to the panel, or do you just want me to read it out?
You can just go ahead, John,
Just before you do that, John, Nick, can you stop the share screen so it's easier for us to read chat and see people's cameras? Thanks.
I think I've done that. Yeah. Far away, Gerhard.
My question is regarding the when you have these different elements in installing an offshore wind farm. How big of a risk is ineffective sequencing when doing these constructions? We've got a lot of moving parts, and obviously offshore construction always carries the risk of weather delays that might then cause bottlenecks further up in the supply chain.
But you want me to have a go at that, Mick?
Yeah, John, you go first, please.
Well, yes, Gerard, these are obviously very significant. If you start having a slippage in one element, you can end up with quite catastrophic consequences to the project as a whole. As you'll know, these vessels are, one, very expensive to charter. There's a limited market, limited availability, and they're usually booked up many months, sometimes years in advance for projects. So when you start getting slippage, it is a very serious issue. It'll be interesting to see how the market develops with the sheer scale of these developments coming through, and where we see a mix between developers going for long-term charters as opposed to project-specific charters and so forth for vessels. But certainly this is an area that can cause a lot of difficulties, a lot of problems. The contracting arrangements can vary in terms of whether they're PIMCO charters or whether it's the main contractor's own vessel. So all these things will vary. But Nick, you may have some experience of some of these issues. Do you want to add a few points to that?
Well, other than agreeing with what you've just said, John, and I'd also flagged this contractual point. I think it's recognised that this is an area that we as an industry, and I'm thinking about the legal teams, the Dispute Board Foundation, and the offshore wind industry need to think about the contractual arrangements and try and get the best possible out of those contracts, because we have got a fundamental problem. I don't think we're ever going to move away from multiple contractors. So the sort of arrangement of having 5 contractors, I think, is going to be with us for the duration. And we need to find ways of managing the interaction between those 5 main contractors and the fact that one or several of those contractors will be having to charter expensive specialist vessels. So I think we can do more, and that's something that's in our sights as something that we think we can do better on.
Nick, can I just say, sorry, John, can I just say a few words? One of the issues that we find in the UK sector is that there is an issue because we have statutory adjudication, which applies to anything on land, but it doesn't apply to anything in the water. So that's one issue that people have had to consider, that some parts of the work are subject to statutory adjudication, some aren't. The ways people have found to cope with that is to design a convenient break point on the beach. So it's clear that some of the work is onshore and is subject to statutory and some isn't. I've seen that the question asked about the forms of contract. People have tried various forms of contract. If you look at Norwegian, they started using the NTK, Norwegian forms of contract. People started to use logic forms of contract, but there does seem to be a sort of common consensus in the European offshore wind that the FIDIC Yellow Book with numerous amendments seems to be the contract of choice now. Not everybody's using.
Can I just add, sorry?
Yeah, certainly.
Although that they are trying to use FIDIC as the standard form of contract, they're heavily amending the contract, and they're not looking at dispute boards as the resolution mechanism. They're still trying to use this protectionism process which leaves everybody trying to work through an arbitration process, because it guarantees deliverable of the project as opposed to resolving the issues.
Yeah, I agree with that totally, Keith. What I'm seeing, or what I've seen so far, is that typically that they're looking for a tiered dispute resolution clause. So they have early negotiation and escalation to senior people within the companies. But then, rather than have an interim binding decision, they'll wait for a full-blown arbitration, which just doesn't make sense to me, given the costs.
If I may, I've noticed the tendency of removing the DB and heavily amending is especially in those projects where there is a high component of financing that is assured via EU funds. When we are talking about private investments or strictly national governments, you would see much less amendments than in the ones funded by EU. I guess this is a policy as well. You know, these are my standard proposals. These are my standard way of doing business. And if you want my money, you will have to line up with what I'm saying. And changing that and changing the mentality there takes quite a bit of time, especially after the former Eastern European countries' experience with dispute boards that have been degenerating, if you want, and they were always ending up in arbitration because national governments were not prepared to accept the non-binding decision, if you please, for a while. And that has been pushing a bit dispute boards away from projects financed by EU in particular for the time being. A movement to reintroduce them and reassess them and integrate them in national legislations has been started, but it'll take a bit of time until we get there.
Can I just say, I think one thing I would say on Gerard's question is that whatever arrangement, whatever contracts are in place, the critical element the contract has to address is weather risk and the balance of that weather risk, and then with an effective dispute resolution arrangement thereafter, because it is an absolutely critical element of these projects.
Simon's posed a question, and he asks, can you give us an idea of the size of contracts and duration? Nick, I know that you've done some recent projects. What typical size stuff were you seeing, and what was the duration?
I think that, you know, the duration becomes relevant when it sort of starts, go beyond, when the construction is more than, let's say, 5 years, which is sort of typical for an offshore wind project. So offshore wind is at a point where the length of the construction contract is not the major driver in terms of DBs having particular benefit. That the DB is needed because of the issue that we've just been talking about in relation to offshore wind, but others such as obviously hydro, you know, you're talking about longer construction periods than 5 years. Operational contracts on waste to energy, again, long-term contracts, so therefore problematic, and as a result the DB brings additional benefits. In terms of size, all of the major contracts on an offshore wind project are of a size where you can justify a 3-man dispute board, and the cost benefit analysis does apply. And I think finally, you know, when we move into some of the other sectors like onshore wind, then probably you're going to have to go for a single person DB in order to ensure that the economics work. I think that there's more work for the dispute board community to do in order to make dispute boards more cost effective in terms of finding ways of keeping the cost down.
Sorry, Nicholas, when you say that last remark, can you give us an idea of what your thinking is?
Well, again, sorry, this is a rather offshore wind focused response, but that's the area I'm most interested in. So one of the challenges in relation to dispute boards on offshore wind is the fact that if you're going to have all 3 dispute board members visiting the site location, i.e. offshore, you've got to keep them, you've got to train them up in terms of being able to visit that environment, because there's no point in just sitting in a boat and looking at the substation and the turbines. You need to physically get onto the physical asset, which means that you need to have passed and keep updated some fairly expensive training. And obviously, one of the things that has happened as a result of the pandemic and other developments is the use of drones, and we can actually with experience build up more effective ways of carrying out the site visits that are a necessary part of dispute boards, but doing it in a way which is at a lot lower cost than the current arrangement, which is whereby all 3 dispute board members have to physically visit the site themselves. So that's the sort of thing I think is relevant.
Yeah, I think just thinking off the top of my head, I would say that if let that not be a hindrance, I believe that flexibility is what dispute boards are about. If it comes down to that sort of issue, that'll be one of the issues. I'm sure a way can be found. So I don't see that as being a hindrance, and I don't think we should think of it as being a hindrance. I think we should think of that as being something to be ironed out on the way.
Okay.
In addressing that question from the waste to energy sort of projects that I've been involved in the UK in, say, the last 3 years, typically anything from 50 million up to 300 or 400 million. In the last 24 months, I've been involved in about 40 million pounds worth of disputes that have gone on to adjudication processes. They're not dispute board processes. Some of them have been statutory adjudications, some of them have been contractual. There's certainly a need for a dispute board process in the United Kingdom. And I should say not just a dispute board, a dispute avoidance and adjudication board process. And internationally, a lot of the big plants can be up to $1 billion. They're probably going to be looking at a 3 to 5 year construction period. So they certainly lend themselves to dispute boards. The budgets are there. We know that they're going to end up having a scrap along the way, and it seems silly to store it up for a large arbitration at the end.
Sean, if I could just add, sorry, Simon, please
go for it, Keith.
Yeah, I think my experience in the last 5 years of offshore wind, both from Nicholas and John, is that I'm finding the biggest elements outside weather in terms of disputes are purely on fabrication. And the issue of where that fabrication is carried out, even though it's a UK project, the fact is that more and more projects are being carried out or the fabrication is being carried out in the Middle East or the Far East. And then we get that jurisdictional problem. And it's how we make a dispute board have that, and dispute avoidance board really have the power to be able to make a decision that impacts on the different jurisdictions.
There's a question. Sorry, carry on, Simon.
Well, I'm not sure I see too much of a problem there, and I'd be interested now the thoughts, because if you look at a hydroelectric scheme, typical hydro scheme, and not only do many have boards, but I think that's where boards started with tunneling, didn't they? But they went on to hydro schemes very quickly. You know, in a hydro scheme, some of your major plants, big cost items, come from other countries. We've managed. So I don't see that as a hindrance.
Good. Okay.
If maybe Thursday's optimistic day, I don't know, but I don't see these as hindrances. For me, I see the biggest hurdle is what Georgiana was talking about. It's getting the funders on board. And it would seem to me, maybe I picked up the wrong bit of straw, but it seems to me that they are our target.
Simon, I agree with you on that.
That's what Georgiana's doing, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Simon. I didn't mean it as a hindrance. I think the important thing is to get the employers to accept that the dispute board can resolve the issues but encompass the different jurisdictions to make it work.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
I-
Sorry,
Sorry,
George,
I can see a question in from Ian Clark about enforceability.
yes.
Yeah, before
the
that,
dis-
there, Sean, if I may, ideally, when they negotiate the investment treaties, they always have the project data as part of the treaty. Look at the hydropowers in Tajikistan, in Uzbekistan, and in some other Central Asian countries that are undergoing now. In the investment treaties, they have the fish of the project, and they have the main details, and surprise, they do mention compulsory dispute boards. And not a jurisdiction problem. They don't have a problem with the manufactured products. As Simon said, most of the problems there were related to delays and unforeseen soil conditions. So dispute boards there have done a beautiful job. Sorry, Sean, now please.
No, that's fine. Ian's posed a question about the enforceability. So if we say, take two examples, say South Africa and the United Kingdom, you can, once you've got your dispute board decision, you'll go to the local court and they'll enforce it quite swiftly. What happens in other jurisdictions is that you're probably going to have to get an arbitral award to enforce. South Africa's been guided by the jurisprudence coming out of the UK with statutory adjudication. There's numerous FIDIC contracts in South Africa where there isn't a statutory scheme, but there is a contractual scheme, and the courts have been quite willing to give summary enforcement. Problem is when you get to civil code countries, they're not as comfortable with the interim nature.
And the purpose of my question was, of course, to flag that, because I'm well aware that was the answer, to be honest. but because I'll state my show my colours now. I'm a lawyer, of course, and lawyers, we love disputes, but we also, I'm one of those lawyers who genuinely, I'm not being facetious, we do see that I personally think there's a role for dispute boards for definite in this sector. But I see that there are sometimes when it's terminal or it's just not going to work between the parties, and it's got to that stage where the parties have fallen out so badly that arbitration might be the only way. And certainly if the parties are contracted to use arbitral awards as a means of enforcement, that's what you want, and you want to build that into your contracts. And I know, I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted in this call, that you all probably know that, or if you don't, then that's what should be done. But I'm interested to know what your take is on which types of disputes are better for dealt with by boards and which types of disputes inevitably end up in arbitration, because I'm hearing the message from your speakers that the reality is a lot of people do what they've always done. They always go straight to arbitration. And
Sean could add to it, and then of course Nick, John, and Keith, based on their experience. So civil law systems, it has been a learning curve, and in the last 20 years, the majority of them have been deciding whether Europe or MENA or Africa, they all decided at the end of the day that non-compliance with the non-binding decision is a breach of a contractual duty. So the process afterwards was pretty easy. In terms of what civil jurisdictions would look at, what is easier or what is best to be done via dispute boards and what is best to be done via arbitration. For, again, public funded projects, the perspective is that whatever technical issues are in relation with the project and best solved during the implementation of the project should be done by dispute boards. When we get especially financial obligations, given the restraints on the public budgets and given the conditionalities on the spending ways of the money allocated to the projects by various entities, either EU or MDBs or other international financial institutions, then the way preferred would be an arbitral decision. That because civil system public administrative process tends to be very prescriptive and impose certain obligations onto the employers to make sure that they have approached every single possibility in the interest of the entity. Sean, if you have something to add.
Obviously, with the way that the FIDIC form and other forms of contracts are usually that they're tiered dispute resolution clauses. So that means you have to first go through the process of the dispute board. I think if you've got the right dispute board, people will accept their decisions. If there's people that are incompetent or they don't have faith in, it's quite likely that they're not going to accept that decision and try running it before an arbitral tribunal. Now, if you think you've got a dispute board maybe of 3 people and they're 3 eminent people that also sit as arbitrators, their decisions are likely to indicate what a typical ICC arbitral tribunal is going to find. Now, people might choose to run it to arbitration because it gives them longer till they have to pay. But there's still that first step. I think the sophisticated parties will realise that it's probably, if they've constituted the board in the best way possible, that they're going to accept that decision, be willing to pay rather than have the hassle and the cost of trotting off to an ICC type arbitration. Thanks.
Let us not forget, dispute avoidance is the name of the game, not dispute resolution.
Yeah, yeah.
So all disputes should fall under dispute avoidance.
Ideally, yes.
Okay. Can we come to Kevin Main's question about the oil and gas? Kevin, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yes, sorry, I'm just trying to find the chat. If anybody can read my question, just to repeat it, that would be very useful.
I can read it out for you, Kevin. I can read it out.
Yes, it was directed at you, John. Yeah.
Yeah. Transitioning UK North Sea oil and gas installations to electrification is a clear requirement of the UK government, as legislation suggests. What are your thoughts on the Orion project? So I suppose if you're targeted at me, Kevin, I'll go at that first. I don't know how well known the Orion project is outside of us up here in Shetland and northeast Scotland, but it's quite important that it does tie in, exactly as you say, tied in with the transition deal that the UK government has done. And it's a project that's aiming to combine a number of renewable elements, so the onshore wind, offshore wind, interconnector cables, potentially hydrogen plant at Sullomvoe Terminal, but with the aim to electrifying both potentially large-scale new developments west of Shetland. These are potentially new oil and gas developments, along with the existing fields on the east side. I know that some people might think it's something of a contradiction in terms to talk about decarbonising hydrocarbon production, but that is what this deal is really all about. And I suppose one of the arguments is that if net zero targets are happening across all elements of industry, all manufacturing, production process, and so forth, then there is no justification of why the offshore production process should be in any ways exempt from those net zero targets. So that maybe, if not nullifying the contradiction, certainly blunts it a bit. But what I see really important with this is in Norway, we've already seen floating wind farms providing power to oil and gas installations. And if we're going to see big oil coming in a significant way now, we already have Equinor have certainly involved a lot in offshore wind. If we're going to see big oil coming in a large way now, in a very tight time scale as well, one of the things I note in the Orion project is they're looking for a solution pre-2025, and for this type of project, that is just absolutely around the corner. So I think it's a very important project, and it highlights a lot of the initiative that's going on, as I said, in this transition away from oil and gas.
Good. Thanks for that, John. Kevin, does that answer the question?
Yes, and probably bringing it back into dispute boards. One of the earlier presentations identified a dispute board with or a significant dispute between Essex County Council and UBB Waste, and knowing that the Orion project is gathering a little bit of pace, but the two major performers in it at this moment in time is the Shetland Islands Council, the local governments, and Oil and Gas Technology Centre based in Aberdeen. So there'll obviously be seeking some significant investment from some major players in the, as you say, John, the near future and that. So just in terms of timeframes into dispute boards, at what time in this significant project would it be best to start engaging and thinking about dispute boards?
I go first, Rickard, or somebody else?
No, yeah, go for that, John. Yes, please. And then I've got something else I want to add in, but yeah.
I think as a general statement, the earlier the better, really, to start. I think, as I said, the timescale here is very tight. And as I said, for a lot of reasons, you can certainly see potential problems here, because if the oil industry want these projects to happen, as I say, to be sanctioned and licenses awarded pre-25, and in that they've got to have interaction with power generators, potential linking with interconnector and so forth. There's just a whole lot of things that has to happen in a short period of time. And so I would think looking at it, viewing it, and seeing how that could be constructed, I would have said time is of the essence, and sooner rather than later. Okay. Nick, do you want to?
No, I mean, what I'd like to sort of bring a bit of a summary of the discussion we've had, but linked to the same point. I from what I've heard from everybody, and so I'm taking that everybody's sort of on board with this, is there's a significant job to be done in terms of selling dispute boards. And so I think that's something that we all need to set to. Sean, I see you've got your hand up. So do you want to just come in?
Yeah, Nick, it was just to address how early you should involve dispute boards. The DRBF have been working with various lending institutions, and traditionally the dispute board was created up and running once construction was about to start. But now they're looking at them much earlier on, because there's various issues of multinational people being in the host countries. Georgiana, have you got any information on that you could share?
Well, back in the very early days of the 99 contract, actually, there was a clever thing that the ISPA and FARE programs for Eastern Europe were doing. The technical assistance contracts, the guys who were dealing with the design, who were preparing the procurement of the works contracts or the design build contracts, they were actually also training the staff of the employer and were the ones who were helping selecting the dispute boards before the starting of the project. That was a really, really good method to do things. In time, though, I don't know exactly for what reason, they started to postpone more and more the timing of the putting the dispute board in place, to the point that even if they had a standing board in the contract, in the signed contract, they were actually naming the or putting together, setting up the dispute board only when a dispute would materialize. So there was no use of any prevention or any of the functions with which the dispute board could have helped. There is a country that is now, under current circumstances, an exception to all that, and who seems to do the best of the use of dispute boards in terms of both prevention and observance of the dispute board decision, and that's Georgia. Is the only one in Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, that actually is very happy with dispute boards and has been for the last few years. I think they've learned quite a bit from the experience of the other countries and selected what was the best outcome for the process.
Okay. So, sorry, Keith, do you want to quickly come in because we need to close?
Okay, I think the important thing is, as Simon said, dispute boards has to be about dispute avoidance. And the earlier we engage on projects, will avoid disputes. Becoming involved at a later stage usually is too late. We need to get early engagement of the dispute board in the concept stage of the project.
Yeah, good. I thank you, Keith. I was going to make the same point.
Right.
So I think that is one of the crucial elements in terms of selling dispute boards. I'd just like to flag that there is a group that I've set up on LinkedIn for dispute boards specifically in relation to offshore wind. So if you have any questions or opinions that you would like to relay to the wider community, then please use it for that purpose. I'm thinking about the issue of, you know, should we be looking at contract form? You know, do we adopt the approach that it's sort of working, so we shouldn't fix it? Or is that something that we should be looking at? And I've also done some work on cost benefit analysis, which again, I'm happy to share through that medium.
Could you please, Nicholas, could you share the name of that group? Because Simon had a good point earlier, and DRBF is trying for years to put together data on the proper use, if you want, of dispute boards in wind farm, in offshore projects. So that would be great if you could put it in. I've also put an email address for anybody who wants to share data. Of course, they could be anonymized. You don't have to put the people names in there, but project names and location and project values would be, of course, one of the elements. You could also find there is already an Excel table that is currently presented on the DRBF website, listing a history of projects that have been employing dispute boards in time. And I think we go back to 1975, isn't it, Simon, as early forms of dispute boards.
Yeah, and it's crucial to get this data, because we use this to sell the concept.
Exactly. So Nick, please share with us the name of the LinkedIn group, and everybody please feel free to ask any of us at any time any questions that we could help with, or and send us all the information that you can about the use of dispute boards in your industry. Thank you, Nick.
Okay, so you've got the name there, so that's great. So I'd like to close at this point, and would also recommend that you look out for similar discussions. We intended today to be broad across renewables, so I hope those who are not into things other than offshore wind have been too disappointed about that. But the good news is that we are planning sessions on onshore wind and offshore winds explicitly. But I might be stealing Georgiana's thunder, so at that I will promise I'll say no more.
That is more than welcome, don't worry. Yes, we're going to have a session dedicated to offshore winds, and Nicholas is going to run it as well. And we hope to see as many of you there as possible. We would also have next Thursday a webinar dedicated to the dispute boards users, and in particular public authorities this time, a discussion about would a 3-member DB be better than a 1-member DB? Is it the case or is not the case, and why? So please check the DRBF website for the events calendar, and we'd like to see as many as possible of you there soon. Thank you very much for coming today.
Before we all depart, I just wanted to say that there's a Lisbon International Conference at the end of June. It's likely to be one of the first times that we're able to actually get together internationally. You can see the details for the Lisbon conference on the DRBF website, and you can register there.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Georgiana.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Bye.
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 Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.